concluded. Members can take their seats. Questions without notice. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that since deposing Malcolm Turnbull, he's lost Wentworth in his majority, lost the member for Chisholm, ensured just 10 sitting days in the next 8 months? Can the Prime Minister also confirm that earlier today he lost control of himself, delivering one of the most hysterical press conferences in Australian political history? Why isn't Malcolm Turnbull still Prime Minister? Because none of this happened under him.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to losing control, the Labor Party lost control of our borders, and they should be ashamed of it.
The member for Brisbane.
My question is also to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's been able to implement strong policies that protect Australia's borders? What are the risks of failed alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Brisbane for his question. The members on this side of the House, when we came into government in 2013, confronted one of the most difficult policy challenges that a government could face. Not only did we have to do with the fiscal and financial wreckage of what the Labor Party had left us back in 2013, not only did we have to do with a carbon tax they promised not to introduce, but then introduced in one of the greatest defiances we've seen of the Australian people in the lie they told to the Australian people prior to that election, Mr. Speaker. But the carnage and horror of what the Labor Party allowed to happen on our borders and seas to our north should be to their eternal shame. And so when we came to government, we did what we said we would do. We said we would stop the boats, Mr. Speaker, and put an end to this horrific tragedy, and that is exactly what we did. Now, those opposite tried to stop us. Those opposite the Labor Party mocked us. The Labor Party said it could never happen, that you could never implement the measures that we said we could. And we said three things. We said we would turn boats where it was safe to do so, and we have. We said we would have offshore processing, and the mess of offshore processing that was left to us by the Labor Party. You never get someone to implement something they don't believe in because they always stuff it up. And that is exactly what the Labor Party did when they were dragged kicking and screaming to introduce offshore processing, and the mess we inherited from them we were able to clean up, Mr. Speaker, and ensure that we have maintained that system over the last 5.5 years. And we said we would introduce temporary protection visas, restore them, and we did, and they are legislated, and the Labor Party wants to reverse them, Mr. Speaker. They never learn the lessons from their failures, ever. It was in August of 2008 when the Labor Party, cocky, new in government, thinking they knew everything, that there was no risk, decided to abolish temporary protection visas. They thought there'd be no consequences. 50,000 people turned up on 800 boats, and 1,200 people at least died as a result of that decision. And now, Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party want to do it all again. If they come back into government, cocky and arrogant as they are, they want to come and do it all again. Number one, they will abolish temporary protection visas. They've already proved it. Today, they have made very clear that they will abolish offshore processing as we know it, Mr. It'll all go. It will all go. And if anyone thinks that this weak Leader of the Opposition would turn a boat back where it was safe to do so, they're kidding himself. He hasn't got the medal for it.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that yesterday Queensland LNP leader Deb Frecklington said about the government's plans to force Queensland to privatise its electricity assets, "The Prime Minister's plan is out of touch. Queenslanders want lower power prices, but they don't want asset sales." Isn't the Leader of the Prime Minister's Queensland party correct when she says that the Prime Minister's plans are completely out of touch?
The Treasurer.
Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition refers to the LNP leader in Queensland, Deb Frecklington. So I'll share with the House her statement. LNP leader Deb Frecklington has welcomed confirmation that the federal government's legislation to prohibit misconduct in the energy sector will not allow Queensland's electricity assets to be sold. We welcome efforts to stamp out misconduct and ensure the lowest possible prices for consumers. Queenslanders want lower prices, but they don't want asset sales, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and then this is what is difficult for the Leader of the Opposition from Deb Freckleton. Unfortunately, the Palaszczuk government has been using electricity as a secret tax for years, Mr. Speaker. Labor is drunk on the revenue this secret tax generates, and according to its own budget, will rip off more than $8.5 billion from Queensland electricity customers over 5 years. So which side is the Leader of the Opposition on? On the side of Queensland consumers or on the side of Queensland energy companies and the state government? And she goes on. And she goes on. Instead of lowering prices, the Palaszczuk Labor government is solely focused on profit maximisation and has allowed government-owned generators to abuse their market power and to price gouge, Mr. Speaker. And it goes on, and this is probably the most relevant statement for the Leader of the Opposition from Deb Freckleton, because she says Bill Shorten, the Leader of the Opposition's reckless 45% emissions reduction target, will, according to Queensland's Labor's own expert panel on renewable energy, cause the early closures of Queensland coal-fired power stations. So, Mr. Speaker, Deb Freckleton has a lot to say today. She has a lot to say. She says that the Leader of the Opposition is sending power prices up for Queenslanders. She says about the blue-collar workers in Queensland at those coal-fired power stations that Labor is selling them out, Mr. Speaker. And she says she's on the side of the Liberal and National government at the federal level are doing everything they can to lower power prices. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is a test. This legislation is a clear test of the Leader of the Opposition. Will he continue to be a proxy for big business and big energy companies, or will he join with us in stamping out misconduct and ensuring the lowest possible energy prices for Australian families and businesses?
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the government is acting to keep Australians safe from those seeking to do harm? What are the consequences of alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question and his service to Australia in the cause of national security, not just as a member of this place, but as a policeman in Victoria who has worked in the area of counter-terrorism. He knows what he's talking about, Mr. Speaker, and that's why he's been so pleased to be part of the government that is absolutely committed to keeping Australians safe and doing what is necessary in terms of legislative powers that support police, ASIO and other security agencies to ensure that terrorists and organised criminals and pedophiles and others are not able to exploit the weaknesses in our laws to get on with their evil business. Now, we have brought legislation into this place to ensure that those agencies can get access to the encrypted communications of terrorists, pedophiles and organised criminals. Now, we've been on this for months and months. It's gone through a committee process, and in this place today, the Labor Party are frustrating the passage of that bill through this place for one simple reason: to try and play political games in an effort to try and embarrass the government and undermine border protection laws in this country, Mr. Speaker. Don't tell us that the Labor Party is in lockstep with the government when it comes to national security, Mr. Speaker. We're not in step. We're not even on the same page. The Labor Party, when it comes to national security, are unwilling travellers, Mr. Speaker, very unwilling travellers. And our government will continue to focus on delivering the laws and the powers that will keep Australians safe. But for the sake of a headline, for the sake of a vote in this place to play tricky politics, Mr. Speaker, they are prepared to sell out national security for a TV grab, Mr. Speaker. That is the character and the mettle of the Leader of the Labor Party. And he has been tested over the last 24 hours, Mr Speaker, and he has been found wanting. 30 years ago was the last time I'm advised that the opposition has sought to go through a bill clause by clause. 30 years ago. It's an old trick, but it's just as ugly, Mr Speaker, when it's particularly being used to delay the important national security legislation which the Labor Party has had to be dragged to. They have had to be dragged to when it has come, Mr Speaker. Slowing down the divestment legislation, Mr Speaker, as a political tactic to ensure that these other measures cannot be addressed. Now, Mr Speaker, this is very disappointing. It is incredibly disappointing, but the Australian people know who they can trust when it comes to keeping them safe. It's the Liberal and Nationals Party. The Labor Party, their form is too well known, Mr Speaker.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that yesterday the Queensland Premier slammed his plan to force Queensland to privatise its electricity assets, saying, and I quote, "If he wants to start a war with Queensland, well, he's got one, because we're not selling our assets." It just goes to show that they have no idea when it comes to a national energy policy. Isn't the Queensland Premier correct when she says this government has no idea when it comes to national energy policy?
The Treasurer is the call.
Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister just said, Labor shamelessly and disgracefully today used a tactic to shut down debate on our legislation to prevent misconduct in the energy sector, a tactic that hasn't been used for 30 years, Mr Speaker. Now, you know what happened 30 years ago? It was so long ago. So long ago. But you know what happened 30 years ago? Labor delivered a surplus, Mr Speaker. 30 years ago was the last time Labor delivered a surplus, when Taylor Swift was born, Mr Speaker. Now, the reality is we have legislation before the Parliament which will deliver lower prices for Australian families, lower energy prices, a more stable system and a better deal for businesses. And the member for Hume and our government have been driving changes across the sector which have already seen some of the energy companies reduce their standing offers by 10%, delivering major savings to businesses and to households. We saw the prices come down in July, Queensland and South Australia, from July of this year. We've passed legislation through this House to abolish the limited merits review, which, if the Labor Party had done it when they were in government, would have saved consumers $6 billion. We've prevented shortfalls in the domestic gas market that Labor set up a shortfall for the domestic market when they ignored their warnings in their own energy paper back in 2012 and ignored the warnings from AEMO. We, on the other hand, have ensured sufficient gas into the domestic market. And we're putting in place storage, backup for more renewables that are coming online, and the Minister for Energy is working with his state counterparts to get a reliability guarantee put in place. So, Mr Speaker, when Labor was last in office, electricity prices doubled. When the Labor Party was in office in South Australia, they had a big experiment. We're seen in other states, like in Victoria, following the closure of Hazelwood, wholesale prices go up by more than 80%. We saw the same thing happen in South Australia after the closure of Northern. This is a very serious matter. This is not a time to stand with the energy companies. This is the time to stand with Australian families and businesses.
The member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, to our shame, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples remain one of the most incarcerated people in the world. Again this year, the Closing the Gap strategy report showed no improvement in the disadvantage experienced by First Australians. For over 200 years, non-Indigenous people have been writing policy and legislation, destroying the lives and culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, taking away their right to self-determination, health, land rights, justice and sovereignty. We need to stop doing this now. Prime Minister, when will the government pursue substantial policy and legislative changes beyond constitutional recognition? When will you legislate a voice to Parliament, as outlined in the Statement of the Heart?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. As he knows, the Joint Select Committee into constitutional recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples delivered their report, a bipartisan report, and I want to thank the chair of that committee, the members for Barrow and Senator Dodson for the work that they have done, and other members who have taken a passionate and enthusiastic interest in the work of that committee. It was established in response to the Statement from the Heart and the Referendum Council report, and the main item the committee considered was the idea of a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and a way for them to be consulted and engaged about the policies and laws that affect them at the local, regional and national level. Now, after 8 months of consultations, there were 4 major recommendations. In order to design a voice that best meets the needs and aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the committee recommended a process of co-design between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and government be initiated in communities across Australia to design a voice that can help deliver practical outcomes. Secondly, that following a successful co-design process, the Parliament should consider the legislative, executive and constitutional options to establish such a voice. Thirdly, that the committee heard that Australians have a desire to have a fuller understanding of the history of Australia and the history, traditions and culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the history of contact between black and white Australians. And fourthly, the committee recommends the establishment in Canberra of a national resting place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander remains, which could be a place of commemoration, healing and reflection. Now, it's clear that from this report that much more work needs to be done along the lines of what they've recommended regarding the voice proposal. We have always supported giving Indigenous people more of a say at a local level, and we support the process of co-design of the voice because if we are going to change the lives of Indigenous Australians on the ground, we need their buy-in on the matters and policies that affect them, and that includes the targets on things like closing the gap, that they should have a very strong say and a partnership in defining and then having a participation role in having met them. So we support constitutional recognition but maintain our reservations about a voice, but we prefer to establish local bodies in the first instance and then build on a successful model to inform a regional and then a national governance model. So this is a ground-up process. We thank the committee for their report and the bipartisan nature of the way they work together and the sincerity with which they've put forward their recommendations, and we look forward to advancing those in the months ahead.
The member for Bono.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the government's strong border protection policies are helping us balance the budget and deliver a strong economy? Is the Treasurer aware of any weaker approaches that would result in budget blowouts?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. Now, he knows, we know on this side of the House, that politics involves tough choices. Politics involves difficult decisions, and in politics you can't just listen to the last commentator or the last critic. Sometimes you really have to hold your line and stay the course. And nowhere is that clearer than in one of the most difficult issues to confront this parliament, which is around border protection, Mr Speaker. Because in border protection you have to put in place policies that are a deterrent to the evil people smugglers who prey on the most vulnerable in the community. And if you don't get it right, the consequences are terrible. People lose their lives at sea, people end up in detention, there is a budget blowout. Now, Mr Speaker, we all remember Kevin Rudd going to the Australian people in 2007, saying he was a big C economic conservative like John Howard, and he wouldn't touch the most successful border protection policies put in place by that government. But what happened over the subsequent years of a Labor government, or a Labor Greens government, was that the border protection policies were unwound. Over 50,000 people arrived in over 800 boats. There were 1,200 deaths that we know of at sea. Over 8,000 children were in detention while Labor was in government. And in July 2013, there were 10,200 people in detention, including nearly 2,000 children. 17 detention centres had to be opened, and there was a budget blowout of around $16 billion, Mr Speaker. In stark contrast, and I want to pay credit to the now Prime Minister and then Minister for Border Protection for the work that he did in stopping the boats, closing the detention centres, ensuring lives were not lost at sea and that children were removed from detention. The benefit of these policies is what we restored order to our program and we increased our humanitarian program from 13,750 to 18,750 a year in 2018-2019. And we've closed those detention centres, Mr Speaker, and we've won the respect of the Australian people for the strong policies that we've put in place, which have not only helped the budget, but most importantly put an end to the business model of those people smugglers and put an end to the tragic loss of life at sea.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister please tell the House which clause in his divestment legislation prevents the government from forcing states to privatise their electricity assets?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the legislation makes very clear that when there is a divestment of a government asset, it will go to another government entity, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Kennedy stood up in this parliament less than an hour ago and sought to move an amendment to make that abundantly clear,
Members
Mr
on
Speaker.
my right, the Leader of the House, the Leader of the Opposition on a members will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Yes, it was on direct relevance. It was a very specific question. I asked the Prime Minister, as he's done all day, given his energy questions to the Treasurer, but the question was very clear, so whoever in the government can answer it. What clause prohibits the privatisation of state electricity assets? It's a simple question. It's a clause.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Any clause.
Leader of the Opposition. The Treasurer has the call.
Section 4, Schedule 1, Item 1, page 25, lines 3 to 18. Make it very clear if the body corporate is an authority of the Commonwealth or an authority of the state or territory, the court may order the body corporate to dispose of those interests in security or assets, and it goes on to another state or authority. And then this is the amendment that the member for Kennedy was making clear. To avoid doubt, the court cannot make an order under subsection 3 for the body corporate to dispose of interests in securities or assets otherwise than in accordance with paragraph 3A, Mr Speaker. Now, the question really is for the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition was not prepared to listen from the member for Kennedy, to hear his amendment, to debate his amendment, to vote on his amendment, to support his amendment, which would make absolutely clear that government assets, if they were divested, would remain in government hands, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Hume knows this, the Prime Minister knows this, and every member on this side of the House knows this. But really, we have to ask the question, why is the Leader of the Opposition covering up for the big energy companies? Why is the Leader of the Opposition refusing to stand with Australian families, Australian pensioners, Australian small business people and indeed some of the large energy users in the steel sector, in the aluminium sector, in the paper sector, across the economy? Why is it that the Leader of the Opposition is turning his back on the Australian people? Mr Question, there must be a reason. There must be an answer, and we need to know why, because the Australian people at the next election will know there's a choice between a Liberal and National government that stands on the side of Australian families and businesses and lower power prices, and a Labor Party that stands with the big energy companies and want to see their power bills only go one way.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Ryan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General please update the House on the importance of strong and consistent border protection measures, and is the Attorney-General aware of alternative approaches that will put Australia's strong borders at risk?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And the member is very well aware that this government has turned back 33 boats, resulting in over 800 people being returned. On top of that, more than 2,500 people have been prevented from boarding leaky, dangerous vessels run by people smugglers, which would have otherwise have been bound for Australia. In total, Operation Sovereign Borders has disrupted 80 ventures and stopped more than 3,300 people arriving in Australia unlawfully. Preventing people from getting on those boats prevents men and women and children drowning at sea. It is as simple as that. The fact is that the alternative was probably the greatest public policy failure in Australia's history. Under members opposite, 50,000 people arrived on over 800 boats, 8,000 children went into detention, and 1,200 men, women and children drowned at sea. Our approach, which was designed by the Prime Minister, which we have held fast to for 5 years, which has stopped the boats and saved the lives, has always had as a central pillar the commitment to offshore processing. There is now, which we are all aware, a bill in the Senate designed to weaken that central pillar of our successful border protection policy. And I'd like to say two things to all members present with respect to that bill. The first is that people are already transferred to Australia where that is medically necessary and appropriate. That already happens. The practical effect of the legislation before the Senate is to achieve nothing more than weakening our borders and sending precisely the wrong message to the people smugglers and their potential victims, which causes the loss of life at sea. The second thing that I'd like to say with respect to it, Mr Speaker, is that as Attorney-General and Acting Home Affairs Minister, I've offered briefings at the absolute highest level to all members of the crossbench, and I would like to thank those crossbench members who have accepted those briefings, even when their ultimate view might differ from that of the government. But I must say that members who would appear to commit to support a position which would weaken our borders on an issue as critical as this and not accept those briefings, not hear from the people who understand all of the dimensions of this tragic problem, not hear from the people who can say with authority, because they have been on the coalface of this problem, what the outcome of that bill in the Senate might mean, that they would not hear from those people is unbelievably unwise. And I think actually their electorates deserve better than that. They must hear from the experts before they make that.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to my last question and the subsequent answer. If the government legislation prohibits the privatisation of state electricity assets, why is the amendment from the member for Kennedy even necessary? And further, why is it that privatisation will only be ruled out for the time being because the member for Kennedy is now writing government energy policy?
The Leader of the House. The Treasurer has the call.
The real question is, why doesn't the Leader of the Opposition stand up for the consumers of Queensland, Mr Speaker? Why doesn't the Leader of the Opposition stand with us and the member for Kennedy and other members of the crossbench for this amendment, which will make it absolutely abundantly clear that when there is an asset that is divested, that it cannot be privatised, Mr Speaker? And why doesn't the Leader of the Opposition stand up for the blue-collar workers he said that he represents in the Tomago aluminium smelter, across the paper manufacturers and the like? Mr Speaker, there are lots of questions, and those questions are to the Leader of the Opposition. He needs to stand up for energy consumers.
Has the Treasurer concluded his answer? Treasurer's concluded his answer. The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Will the minister update the House on why the government's strong border security policies have been so successful? Is the minister aware of any threats to the government's successful border security policies?
The Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that this government stopped the boats. We know that this government has closed 17 detention centres that were opened by those opposite. We know that this government has got 2,000 kids out of detention who are forcibly placed there by those opposite. And we know now that they want radical change to Australia's system of offshore processing and resettlement. We also know that what they propose is not about children, Mr. Speaker. There are 10 children on Nauru, 4 of whom will shortly resettle in the United States, leaving 6 children in Nauru. We know that it's not about medical transfers, Mr. Speaker, because there is a process in place in relation to medical transfers, and it does allow third country resettlement, and that has a third country transfer for medical attention on a temporary basis, and that has occurred more than 200 times in relation to children. What it's about, what the opposition and the Greens propose, is about ending regional processing and resettlement. That is fundamentally what it's about. Last time that happened, Mr. Speaker, 50,000 people arrived unlawfully by sea, 1,200 people drowned at sea, including children. We'll never know how many, but we know that children drowned under the policies of those opposite. Today they go further with this bill that is proposed, Mr. Speaker, which fundamentally will end regional processing and resettlement. And it's very important that people understand how this bill operates. Under this bill, Mr. Speaker, if a doctor in Nauru has assessed an individual and said that that person is either not sick or capable of being attended to in Nauru, that is irrelevant if 2 doctors in, say, Hobart via Skype say that person should come to Australia for assessment. It's not required that those doctors say that the person is sick. It is merely required that 2 clinicians anywhere in Australia say that that person should come to Australia for assessment, and it doesn't matter under this bill if the doctors in Nauru or Manus who have actually seen the person say that that is not appropriate or required. It is an absurd proposition, Mr. Speaker. It will lead to the complete breakdown of Australia's system of offshore processing and resettlement, and it proves once again that the opposition fundamentally cannot be trusted on this issue. We know what happened last time.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can the Prime Minister possibly expect Queenslanders to believe that he is not planning to force Queensland to privatise electricity assets when Recommendation 2 of the government's own electricity report recommends that Queensland's state-owned power stations should be sold off?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've made it very clear we don't support the privatisation of the Queensland assets. And it's the Labor Party who seems to be voting against the member for Kennedy's amendment to an important bill in this House, which would exactly do that, Mr. Speaker. So the ACCC has found that in Queensland, black coal generators has increased the price of some generation capacity despite no increase in fuel costs. This was likely due to a lack of competitive constraint and the highly concentrated market structure. The ACCC has found that the Queensland Government should take immediate steps to remedy the past overinvestment of their network businesses in order to improve affordability of the network. This would lead to savings for consumers of Queensland by $110 a year. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that it was a Labor government back in Queensland in 2011, the Bligh government, that saw the consolidation of 3 businesses into 2 in the energy generation assets. And this concentration has elevated wholesale prices due to low competition, Mr Speaker. So if anyone has a case to answer for the high prices in Queensland, it's Labor governments past and present, Mr Speaker. We on this side of the House have been seeing energy prices come down as a result of actions we have taken, and we on this side of the House have put into this place a piece of legislation to hold the energy companies to account. Unfortunately, it's the Leader of the Opposition who turns his back on this debate, who has turned his back on the Australian people.
The member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Can the minister update the House on how the government is supporting the work of the Australian Defence Force with strong and consistent border protection policies? Can the minister also tell the House what impact alternative approaches would have on the work of the ADF?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mackellar for his question. And it's extremely unfortunate, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party is trashing our border protection and national security policies in order to win a cheap political stunt in the House of Representatives. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. Labor has proven that they are not fit to be in government because they would rather have a cheap political win in the House of Representatives, in the Canberra bubble, than protect our borders and our national security and support our servicemen and women of the Australian Defence Force and in particular the Navy. That's where the Labor Party's leadership has taken the Labor Party at the end of the sitting year. It is absolutely disgraceful. Labor cannot remember back before 2013. Mr Speaker, as the Minister for Defence, I don't want the servicemen and women of the ADF, in particular the Navy, recovering dead bodies from the sea north of Australia of people who paid people smugglers to come to this country on dangerous boats and vessels. Who can forget the work that the ADF had to do during Labor's period in office recovering bodies? Has the Labor Party forgotten the boat crashing on the rocks at Christmas Island? Crashing on the rocks, Mr Speaker. In December 22, of the 92 people on board, 48 died. 48 died. How can Labor forget? In October 2001, Civ 10. Over 350 people perished south of Java. The ADF, the Navy, had to do this work of protecting our borders from people smugglers, and they had to do the work of cleaning up Labor's mess, literally, because of the deaths at sea and because of a cheap political stunt that Labor wants to pull today to impress their friends in all sorts of parts of the left agenda in this country. They are prepared to make our servicemen and women of the ADF do that work again. It is disgraceful. And as the Minister for Defence, I call on the Labor Party to see the error of their ways, to withdraw this threat in the Senate, to use their numbers to damage our border protection policies, to dismantle offshore processing, because that's what the Labor Party is doing, dismantling one of the 3 legs of the stool that has stopped people smugglers and their evil trade.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he promised that privatising New South Wales electricity assets would bring down power prices, but they went up and up? And that now he is asking Australians to take him at his word when he says he won't force other states to privatise their electricity assets, which would further push up electricity prices.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the only electricity assets that the Commonwealth Government has had a direct engagement with me as Treasurer was that we arranged for the full purchase of the Snowy Hydro scheme, and that was announced in the budget before last and it was executed in this budget. So the form and track record of me as Prime Minister and Treasurer is actually to put those types of assets into public ownership.
Good answer. The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence, representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how the government is implementing strong border protection policies without affecting or impacting our foreign aid budget? And how might a different approach undermine our foreign aid budget?
The Minister for Defence, representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Goldstein for his question. Mr Speaker, one of the extremely unfortunate impacts of the Labor Party dismantling the offshore processing system that has helped stop the people smugglers' evil trade is that the record that they had in government, not just in the unfortunate deaths at sea, but in the massive budget blowout that will occur because they'll have to reopen the processing centres, and we've closed 17. We've closed 17 processing centres. We've stopped the billions of dollars being spent every year on the interdiction of boats and the settlement of asylum seekers. Because we've stopped Labor's policies, we haven't had to spend that money on the response to people smuggling. But when Labor was in power, of course, they ran out of money because they didn't have the strength to recognise that sometimes governments have to make tough decisions, and because they didn't have the strength to really be in government, and they oversaw 50,000 unauthorised arrivals on 800 boats, which was a disgraceful and failed policy. It cost other parts of the budget. And as the minister representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs, I should remind people, because Labor's obviously forgotten, that in 2012 the then Labor government diverted $375 million from the foreign aid budget to pay for the rising costs of food and housing for asylum seekers released into the community. So Labor had to take from the foreign aid budget $375 million to pay for their failed border protection policies. And they had taken over from the Howard government a policy that had stopped the boats in the Howard government. They then restarted the people smugglers' evil trade. The coalition was elected in 2013, and the current Prime Minister, as the minister at the time, stopped the boats with the policies that were necessary, turning back boats, offshore processing, temporary protection visas. And now the Labor Party wants to dismantle it all. The Labor Party wants to dismantle temporary protection visas. In fact, the member for Braddon is nodding. The member for Braddon is nodding. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party wants to dismantle offshore processing. They want to dismantle temporary protection visas. And if anybody believes this weak leader of the opposition, who can't even control his left in the caucus, would turn back a boat, they're kidding themselves. So if Labor wins next year, if the people choose Labor, you will have the boats starting again. The people smugglers will see the green light. The welcome mat will be put out to the people smugglers, and a lot of the Labor Party members know it, Mr Speaker, and they've gone along with these tactics to gain a cheap political stunt. So all those Australians who support foreign aid and the foreign aid budget, like I do and the member for Goldstein, get ready for Labor having to rob Peter to pay Paul if they get them back into office and their policies are implemented again.
The member's time has concluded. The member for Braddon.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that under his discredited forced divestment laws, the government could force Tasmania to sell off its state-owned electricity assets? When so many Tasmanians are already doing it tough, why does the Prime Minister want to make life even harder by privatising Tasmania's electricity assets, which will put up power prices?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, if I was the member for Braddon in Tasmania and I wanted to stand up for the constituents of Braddon, you know what I'd be doing? I'd be rejecting Labor's big new property tax, Mr Speaker, because Labor's big new property tax is going to hurt 3,500 people in the electorate of Braddon, Mr Speaker, and Labor's big new retiree tax will hurt more than 3,500 people in the electorate of Braddon. So, Mr Speaker, I say to the member for Braddon, if you want to stand up for your constituents and you want to stand up for the people of Tasmania, support us on this side of the House and our low-tax, high-growth agenda, Mr Speaker. Now, when it comes to energy, no side of politics has put more investment into Tasmania than the Liberal and National government, Mr Speaker. We support pumped hydro facilities across your state. We support another interconnector from your state to the mainland, Mr Speaker. We've supported renewable energy projects, wind projects across your state of Tasmania, and what we are doing is opening up new opportunities for energy users and for energy producers across the state of Tasmania. But, Mr Speaker, the real question for the member for Braddon is what problem does she have with a piece of legislation that could potentially force a divestment of an asset as a last resort if the conduct of the company is dishonest, in bad faith, fraudulent, for the purpose of manipulating prices, and the divestiture order made by a court is proportionate and targeted to the conduct, Mr Speaker. What's wrong with that? I say to the people of Tasmania, no government assets will be privatised in the state of Tasmania, but I do say to the people of Tasmania, we are standing with you to deliver you lower energy prices. We want to see families in the electorate of Braddon, in the electorate of Denison and right across the electorates of Tasmania. We want to see them benefit from the policies, the ideas and the projects of a Liberal and National government which are only designed to do one thing, send prices lower for Australian families and Australian businesses.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is for the Minister for Families and Social Services. Will the minister update the House how the government is able to support Australians in need through a strong social security system? What impact would a different approach have on the social security system that Australians rely on?
The Minister for Families and Social Services.
Well, I do thank the member for Boothby for her question. She's a strong champion for those Australians who need the support of our social security system in her own electorate. 17,957 who rely upon the age pension, 3,963 the disability support pension, 3,547 New Start. And all of that is delivered through spending $176 billion on social security and welfare. In fact, a number that's risen from $132 billion in the last full financial year that Labor had responsibility for these matters. And we've done that while moving the budget towards balance and surplus. That is good financial management. We've got the social security system back to a sustainable position. Under the previous government, it was growing in expenditure at twice the rate, roughly, that government revenues were growing at. That is unsustainable, and we've fixed that, Mr Speaker, and we've done that through basic managerial disciplines, setting out a plan, executing against the plan, capability and competence with managing money. Now, that is something that Labor has a proven record of being hopeless at. It is no surprise that when you gather together people who are chosen for their skills as union officials, so their core skill is shaking down money from business, like the donation from Unibuilt to the Leader of the Opposition's campaign, when you gather together people whose core skill, whose background is being student activists, so they're good at holding protests and waving signs, when you gather together people whose core skill is being a social justice warrior and showing you how many coloured bracelets they've got on their wrist to show how caring they are, it turns out that people like this are not actually very good at management. And that's why the budget blew out by $16 billion on the cost of detention centres when this hopeless rabble were in control, supposedly, of the budget. And now the key point, Mr Speaker, is that that is $16 billion which is not available to support vulnerable Australians, which is not available to support older Australians with the age pension, which is not available to support Australians with disability because they've lost control of their expenditure. And yet Labor today is going right back to their core beliefs, their mismanagement of border protection. They're going to vote with the Greens to go back to ending offshore protection. That's what they want to do, and that is terrible news. Terrible news for Australians who want secure borders. That's terrible news for vulnerable Australians because it means less money available to support them, and it's terrible news for the people who invariably and tragically are going to end up as the innocent victims of people smugglers, and people will lose their lives as a result.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to his previous answer to the member for Sydney. If he and his government do not support electricity privatisation, why did the Prime Minister sign off on this agreement with Gladys Berejiklian for the privatisation of New South Wales electricity and poles on the 3rd of May 2016?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, that was a decision of the New South Wales state government that was taken after an election where they went to the Australian people, to the people of New South Wales, and that was their policy measure, their initiative. It was also part of the asset recycling program, Mr Speaker, and as a result, when you go to New South Wales these days, you'll see infrastructure getting built. You'll see an economy which is humming along, Mr Speaker. You'll see surpluses. You'll see a state government that is delivering important services for the people of New South Wales. In New South Wales, they have a government that understands that to have a strong economy means you can pay for hospitals, that you can pay for schools, that you can pay for essential services, Mr Speaker. And if you go to Queensland and you're looking for all that earth-moving equipment and all that infrastructure-building equipment, you've got to look a bit further down the coast, because it's all down in New South Wales, because there's a state government in New South Wales which is getting on with the job of delivering important infrastructure for the people of New South Wales. So I commend the New South Wales government for the economic management and leadership that they've been providing for the people of New South Wales. As a citizen of New South Wales, I'm very pleased to be living in a state that is going ahead and doing well.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table the document.
I certainly am. I'm just tabling the agreement and the Prime Minister's signature to the privatisation of New South Wales electricity assets.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted.
Oh, really?
The member for Menzies.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister advise the House on how quickly people smugglers can respond to any changes in border protection policy? And also, can he advise the House if there are any risks in this regard?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, as the member for Menzies knows, as a former Immigration Minister himself, he's very aware of the threats that come from people smugglers who seek to take advantage of Australia. And he would know, like I do, and the Minister for Home Affairs, who is not with us here today, but the Minister of Immigration certainly know, there are 14,000 people currently in Indonesia waiting to get on a boat, ready and waiting. And they're waiting for one thing: the Leader of the Opposition to become Prime Minister of this country. That's what they're waiting for the Leader of the Labor Party to become the Prime Minister of Australia, so it's game on in Indonesia for people smuggling, Mr Speaker, because they know, because it happened back in 2007. They know the form of the Labor Party, and they know if they can get Labor policy back on the books of the Australian government, then they know there's 12,000 to 14,000 people who will be ready and waiting to jump on a boat and pay the money. And the people smugglers know this too. You know, Mr Speaker, under our policies, there used to be a people smuggler who used to run a pretty good business. He's driving a cab in Jakarta now, Mr Speaker, because he's got no people smuggling business, because we put him out of business. We put people smugglers out of business right across Indonesia and all the way up through the people smuggling chain. And we've pursued them and we've had them prosecuted. We've worked with the Indonesian government to do all of those things because we know that this business could revive instantaneously. These networks can be revived and re-established. And that is why it is just beyond belief that the Labor Party, who was so malevolently negligent when they were in government, when it came to their failures on border protection, that they would now, as part of some sort of cheap political point scoring in this chamber, would seek to put all of that at risk and to provide support for the dismantling of offshore processing in this country is truly extraordinary. But the people smugglers know it. They know the mettle of the Leader of the Labor Party. They know the Labor Party. The Labor Party are the best friend that people smugglers have ever had, Mr Speaker. When we talk about busting their business model, Mr Speaker, these characters would be eligible for members of the board of directors of them, Mr Speaker, because of the way they have contributed to their business model as people smugglers in the past. So, Mr Speaker, we don't want to go back to 8,000 children in detention. We got all the children out of detention, Mr Speaker, and on Nauru, as Prime Minister, in the last 3 months, I've got 100 children off Nauru, Mr Speaker, down to the levels that the Minister for Immigration has outlined. We don't want to see 10,000 people go back into a detention. We don't want to see 18 detention centres open again, Mr Speaker. We stop the boats, we'll keep them stopped. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, will let it rip.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Cowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that under his discredited forced divestment laws, the government could force Western Australia to privatise its state-owned electricity assets? And why does the Prime Minister want to make it even harder for Western Australians to make ends meet by forcing WA to sell off its electricity assets, which will make electricity even more expensive?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can tell the member for Cowan that in Western Australia no government assets will be privatised under this legislation, because under this legislation, if there is a divestment at last resort of a government asset, then it goes to another government entity. But I can say to the member for Cowan, if she wants to do something for the people of her electorate and make their lives better off, then stand up to the Leader of the Opposition and his big new property tax, Mr Speaker, because there are 9,443 people in the electorate of Cowan who are going to be worse off as a result of Labor's policy. And what about Labor's big new retirees tax? What about that? Well, in the electorate of Cowan, there are 3,173 people who will be worse off at the next election as a result of Labor proposing a big new retirees tax. Now, Mr Speaker, you know, in the hyperbole of the member for McMahon, in this debate, it was very, very funny, because the other day on divestment he got up in the parliament and he started saying, I'm going to have to write to the government of Venezuela about this legislation. And I thought to myself, Venezuela, the Labor Party, you know, he's already got the Labor Party, their union friends. They've already got the Venezuelan government as a pen pal, Mr Speaker. They've already got them, because I discovered a letter, and the letter is from the CFMEU to the government of Venezuela, and it's titled Comrade Daniel, Mr Speaker. Comrade Daniel. Now, let's remember the Venezuelan election was described by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights as in any way fulfilling minimal conditions for free and credible elections. But what did the CFMEU say to the government of Venezuela about their elections? It's with great satisfaction that we've received reports of your successful presidential elections. We've observed the electoral process and we're satisfied with the transparency and the broad participation of its citizenry, Mr Speaker. So there we have it, the CFMEU, known for its transparency and its adherence to the rule of law, praising the government of Venezuela and their elections for their transparency and adherence to the rule of law. You see, Mr Speaker, the member for McMahon, the member for Port Adelaide, now the member for Cowan are not interested.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. As much as it's very interesting.
No, what's the point of order?
Relevance, clearly, Mr Speaker.
I thank the member for Grayndler.
Mr Speaker, the member for Cowan.
Treasurer has the call.
Lower energy prices for the people of Western Australia. We on this side of the House are. We on this side of the House have put together a piece of legislation which will see Australian families and Australian businesses better off.
The member for Melbourne.
Question is to the Treasurer. Treasurer, to the nearest $1 billion, what is the potential exposure of the taxpayer if, over summer, your government uses public money to underwrite coal-fired power stations or indemnify them against future carbon risk, as the Energy Minister has repeatedly foreshadowed?
Just before I call the Treasurer, the question has an uncanny resemblance to one he's already asked. I do my best to memorise as much as I can, but is it identical? I'll just ask the member. It's not. Okay, I'll take the member's word for it. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Melbourne has a very short memory, because it was under a Labor Green government that they provided $1 billion to coal-fired power generators, Mr. Speaker. The reality is our exposure is through the support that we have been providing in a technology-agnostic way to new projects across the country, which has seen, as the member for Hume and the Minister for Energy has said, a pipeline of $15 billion of renewable energy projects being committed across the country. So our focus is on lower energy prices, and if the member for Melbourne supported consumers and families and businesses in his electorate, he would stop with the antics in this place and get behind our legislation.
The member for McMahon.
Go. I move that so much of standing orders be suspended as would prevent the member for McMahon moving the following motion immediately. The House 1 notes that the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments have failed to provide a consistent energy policy for Australia. B, that the government has embraced respectively an emissions intensity scheme, a clean energy target, at least 6 different versions of the National Energy Guarantee and 3 versions of divestment just this week, before each policy was abandoned. C, the government's most recent attempt at forced divestment policy has been panned by the experts as increasing sovereign risk, chilling investment and putting upward pressure on power prices. D, that the the divestment policy had to be completely rewritten to remove the power to order the divestiture from the Treasurer to the courts. E, that the legislation tabled by the Treasurer yesterday allows for the privatisation of energy assets if divestiture is forced in relation to a government-owned asset. F, that the Treasurer and other government ministers have continually denied that this is the case, despite the legislation being clear on this point. G, that the member for Kennedy has moved an amendment, seconded by the member for Dawson, which seeks to ban privatisations as part of the divestiture process, which confirms that the current bill does not. And 2, condemns the government for their complete failure in energy policy, their botched divestiture policy and for seeking privatisation by stealth. Mr Speaker, there's been a lot of intemperate language in the House and in the building today from the Prime Minister. We've heard of clear and present danger. He's swallowed one too many Tom Clancy novels. A very un-prime ministerial and unedifying performance from the current incumbent of the job. But what we actually see here is what happens when a government's policy agenda falls apart before our very eyes. Falls apart before our very eyes. And nowhere is this more evident than in energy policy, and in nowhere is this more important for the economy and for households than this government's complete failure when it comes to energy policy. Now, this is a government which has had so many energy policies that the House would be forgiven for forgetting just how hopeless they have been when it comes to stability and certainty in energy. The now Treasurer, when he was Minister for Energy, had an emissions intensity scheme as his policy. The House will be forgiven for forgetting that because it lasted less than 24 hours before the extreme right-wing climate change deniers opposite killed the then Energy Minister's policy. Then the Chief Scientist recommended the clean energy target. That lasted a couple of weeks. That had relative longevity as an energy policy for the government before it was destroyed. And then we had the National Energy Guarantee, which was personally designed by the now Prime Minister and now Treasurer. The National Energy Guarantee that was personally designed by them and redesigned by them. We had 4 versions in 14 days of the National Energy Guarantee. And now we have, to make up for their lack of policy, the made-up policy of divestiture. Poorly designed, poorly implemented policy on the run. It's had 3 versions already and it's a week old. Mr Speaker, we had the version that the Treasurer should be able to force divestiture of energy assets. We had the version that the Treasurer wouldn't have the power to force diversion of energy assets, the courts would. And now we have version 3, which the government apparently seemingly embraced during question time, which embraces an amendment moved by the members for Qatar and Dawson. So clearly the legislation allows for privatisation. There shouldn't need to be a Rhodes Scholar to know that it allows privatisation. The members for Kennedy and Dawson could work it out, but the Minister for Energy couldn't work it out, and the Treasurer couldn't work it out. And why would the Australian people be concerned about privatisation under this? Because the government believes in it. The Prime Minister himself says the privatisation of the New South Wales electricity network will place downward pressure on electricity prices, the now Prime Minister said. He believes in it. Now, the Treasurer's alibi here is that the legislation allows for a government entity to be disposed of to another government entity. Who is going to buy these assets which are forced to be divested? Is the Queensland government going to sell it to itself? Are they going to sell it to Tuvalu, maybe, or Morocco, or Tunisia? Which government-owned entity is going to buy the asset which they are forced to divest? Are the people of New South Wales expected to buy the Queensland assets when they've been privatised in New South Wales? I mean, this is absurd. It's absurd policy on the run by the Treasurer, and he should have the gumption to admit he's got this wrong. He should have the gumption to admit he's had to rewrite his policy. And he should have the gumption to admit that his policy will put upward pressure on energy prices. The Minister for Energy says that this side of the House voted 9 times for higher energy prices. I'll tell you what we voted 9 times for good policy. I'll tell you what we voted 9 times for, against sovereign risk. We voted 9 times against a policy which will chill investment in this country. The Treasurer talks about Venezuela. If he wants to talk about Venezuela, he needs to go no further than the nearest mirror. That's where he needs to go if he wants to talk about Venezuela, because he'd see the policies of a country which does not believe in stable policy making, which does believe in sovereign risk. The word sovereign risk should not be uttered about Australia. It should be the first responsibility of the Treasurer of Australia to ensure that the words sovereign risk are not uttered in relation to us. And on this Treasurer's watch, he is introducing sovereign risk in a way which is extremely dangerous for the Australian economy. What this Treasurer has done, and this government has done, is unite energy consumers and energy producers in one view. The energy consumers and the energy producers released a joint statement together with the leaders of the business community earlier in the week to say this is bad policy which will make electricity more expensive. You think if the energy consumers thought that this was a good idea, that it was going to reduce power prices, they wouldn't have signed on to that statement. Well, they did. It's there for all to see. The energy consumers have united with the energy producers. I mean, well done, Treasurer. You've managed to bring Australia together, to unite the producers and the consumers in opposition to your policy. That's what this government's managed to do. It takes an effort, Mr Deputy Speaker. It takes some doing, but they've managed to do it. And that's what happens when you have such bad policy being implemented by this government. You have the opportunity for privatisation of assets. You have that being facilitated by this government. And if they really didn't believe in the privatisation of assets, if they had the chance to make sure that that legislation was crystal clear on that point, maybe if they'd spent more time getting it right, if that's their real view and not their secret view, maybe they would have spent time referring it to an inquiry, having draft legislation, showing it to the states, showing it to the industry, showing it to experts. No state saw this legislation before the Treasurer introduced it yesterday. No industry players saw the legislation. It was introduced confidentially, not released for draft exposure. The Liberal and National Party rooms did not see that legislation. I doubt the Cabinet saw the legislation before the Treasurer introduced it. This is what this government has become. We've reached the nadir of policy making on this Prime Minister's watch. The nadir of policy making on this once great party that once believed in sound economic policy, that once eschewed sovereign risk, that once believed in investment certainty, that once consulted with industry and with consumer groups before embarking on such a policy. This government has lurched from crisis to crisis in energy. It has destroyed one Prime Minister so far, and it should destroy this Prime Minister today. We talk of clear and present danger. We'll talk of clear and present danger if you really want to. And this Prime Minister is a clear and present danger to electricity prices, if that's the language he wants to use. The most un-prime ministerial Prime Minister we've seen since Billy McMahon the nation has been subjected to on their watch. The most un-prime ministerial Prime Minister we could imagine. A man who will always see the politics in any issue. You can take the member for Cook out of the role of State Director of the Liberal Party, but you can't take the State Director of the Liberal Party out of him, because he will always find the cheap political stunt. He will always find the slogan, and he will always find the cheap policy. And where we have divestment, a policy which stands against everything the Liberal Party once believed in, a policy which stands against everything that political and economic conservatives in this country once advocated, we know that this Prime Minister has jumped the shark. He's finally jumped the shark when it comes to economic credibility. Former Liberal leaders will be hanging their head in shame. John Howard and Peter Costello will be hanging their head in shame that our government has been reduced to forcing electricity companies to divest their assets if the government's not happy with the way they conduct themselves. Well, there's a better way, Mr Speaker. There's a better way than this, and it's policy stability and certainty under a Shorten Labor government. And if you're so certain, call an election and we'll bring it on.
Is the motion seconded? The member for Port Adelaide.
It is, Mr Speaker. Thank you very much. Well, Mr Speaker, a very serious energy crisis has emerged under this government, an energy crisis that is crippling household budgets, that is seriously threatening the viability of businesses and hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country, and a crisis that is seriously damaging Australia's reputation as a sound destination for investment, either in energy or in energy-using manufacturing across the globe. In response to this crisis, this government has now reached its 10th energy policy in just this parliament. Its 10th energy policy since the 2016 election, and they still haven't been able to land a single one of them. The emissions intensity scheme, which my colleague, the Shadow Treasurer, spoke about a little earlier, was a policy that had the support of every single business group in the country, every single state government, Labor and Liberal alike, in the country. The National Farmers Federation supported it. The Young Nationals, as the Deputy Prime Minister will remember very well, I'm sure, the Young Nationals annual conference supported the emissions intensity scheme. Extraordinary consensus, yet after one radio interview that the Treasurer did with Fran Kelly in late 2016, smashed by a veto led by the member for Warringah. So the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull tried again, asked the Chief Scientist Alan Finkel to come up with an alternative, and he did, a clean energy target. The story is rather familiar. Every single business group in the country supported it. Every state government, Labor and Liberal alike, supported it. Federal Labor said we could work with it. I'm not sure about the position of the Young Nationals. The Deputy Prime Minister might inform us, but they seem to take a pretty constructive view about energy policy. The National Farmers Federation supported it, and again, a veto led by the member for Warringah. Yep, sorry, I forgot to mention you, the member for Hughes, and many others on the hard right of the Liberal Party to smash yet another attempt to gain consensus to solve the energy crisis that has emerged under this government. So in response to that, we had the National Energy Guarantee. There were 2 versions of that and 4 versions in the dying days of Malcolm Turnbull's Prime Ministership. In just 14 days, 4 versions of the National Energy Guarantee added to the original 2. And you have to admire, maybe not their views on energy policy and climate change, but you have to admire the assiduous way in which the member for Warringah, the member for Hughes, the member for Hume, now the Energy Minister, have gone about demolishing every attempt at energy policy consensus in this country. And in some exquisite irony, the new Prime Minister gave the member for Hume, the chief spearthrower against the National Energy Guarantee, the portfolio. The dog that caught the car was finally given a chance to work on a solution to this energy crisis. And just like the proverbial dog, he's been left utterly bereft of any ideas. He had one idea: throw billions of dollars of taxpayer funds at building new coal-fired power stations, and maybe even indemnify the operator of such a power station for any future carbon risk. Now, trying to find an operator to do that would be pretty difficult. The only business figure who has indicated any interest in partnering with this government on building a new coal-fired power station, of course, is Clive Palmer, whose last great idea was building Titanic 2. But the Australian Industry Group has estimated that indemnifying just one coal-fired power station would cost $17 billion for taxpayers. $17 billion. And added to that brilliant exercise in fiscal recklessness, this government has come up with the idea of divestiture, a Venezuelan-inspired act of neo-Marxism, the likes of which is difficult to find in the 21st century. But they've found it. They've found it. And who supported this? Well, you'd think maybe if this was in the interests of consumers that the consumer watchdog might have come up with the idea after an exhaustive inquiry into the electricity industry over 18 to 24 months. But they did. They considered it and they explicitly rejected it as an extreme measure. You think maybe business groups that use lots of energy might think if this was a measure that would cut their power bills, they'd support it. But to a group, they have said over the last couple of weeks that this is a deep and real sovereign risk that will impact the Australian economy and simply force prices up. Well, the government hasn't asked anyone else, didn't ask any of the state governments, and we learned earlier this week why they didn't ask the state governments, because a more sinister purpose behind this legislation became clear from the Energy Minister, and it was about continuing their 25-year exercise in selling off, in privatising the people's electricity assets. They did it in Victoria, they did it in South Australia, they did it with the support of the now Prime Minister in New South Wales, and they had Queensland, Tasmania, WA, Snowy Hydro and the Northern Territory on their sites. And it took the member for Kennedy to fix the government's mess.
Concluded. The question is that the motion moved by the member for McMahon be agreed to, and I call the Attorney-General.
The member for McMahon used the words cheap political stunt. That is like Darth Vader giving a parenting class. having them accuse anyone in this place of a cheap political stunt, and let's work out why they suspended standing orders. Let's work out why they suspended standing orders at exactly the time they did during question time, because they did not want to face another question on border protection. There is a stunt going on, and that is one that they've orchestrated in the other place. And there will be a price for that stunt, and it won't be cheap. And that's why they are here now, trying to divert the attention away from the fact that their own stunt is blowing up in their face. And every Australian is being reminded of the absolute diabolical tragedy that occurred under their watch, under their policy. And what's the stunt that's going on? They are up there now trying to have a Home Affairs bill in the portfolio that I have stewardship for at the moment, polluted with amendments that relate to medical transfer of Nauru, brought back down to this House. Why are they doing that? To try and cause some modest procedural embarrassment to the government. And what's the price of that? The price of that is to fundamentally destroy one of the three central pillars of a policy that has stopped children drowning at sea. And that's why they're quiet now, and that's why they were quiet in question time, and that's why they've moved this suspension of standing orders so they wouldn't have to hear it anymore. Well, they're going to hear it a little bit more, and let's talk about what an utter and diabolical disaster their policy was. There's a place in WA called Geraldton, 2,500 kilometres from Christmas Island. 2,500 kilometres from Christmas Island. On the 10th of April 2013, 2,500 kilometres from Christmas Island, and not very far, in fact, from Perth, a holiday destination from people who live in Perth. And would you believe the surprise of the people in Geraldton who were having cups of tea, literally, at the cafe, when they looked up and saw an asylum seeker vessel with 66 men, women and children arrive at the doorstep of Geraldton. And you know what? They were the lucky ones, because they made it here. They also, of course, ended up including the children in detention. But there were so many who drowned at sea, which is why we've got this stunt, which is why we've had stunts all week, because it's blowing up in their face. Bring your bill back down here. Let's talk about it. Let's debate it. Let's remind every Australian what it is that you did, what it is that you were responsible for. Because if you support and align with the crossbench, if you do that to revert to the policies that you had, the inevitable result is drownings at sea. And we will never,
ever let that happen again. You know what happened when that boat arrived at Geraldton? You know what happened? Brendan O'Connor. Oh, sorry, the member. The member was the minister. The Home Affairs member at the time, the Home Affairs minister, he released a press release. You know what it said? He said that they would respond to the arrival. Well, thank you very much. I mean, everyone must have been breathing a sigh of relief. They would respond to the arrival of 66 people, the lucky ones who made it, the lucky ones who ended up in detention, the children that ended up in detention, 8,000 of them. And as we've heard today, the cost wasn't just human, although that cost was utterly devastating and tragic. The cost was economic. It cost $16 billion for the taxpayers of Australia to fund that disaster, which they want to run away from, which they never want to talk about again, and which they stupidly put back on the agenda. They put their policy and our discussion of their policy back on the agenda to talk about and for the Australian people to see and remember the disaster and the tragedy. $16 billion. If you don't think that makes a difference, in my portfolio of Attorney-Generals, we run the entire justice and court system, including legal assistance funding, for $1.2 billion. With the money that you wasted in a policy that lives were lost under, you could fund the entire court and justice system in Australia for 16 years. Wow. 16 years with the money that you wasted, propping up a policy that caused the deaths of children. And now, in a stunt, you want to try and unravel the successful response to those years of disaster. Right. And another thing that you've done today is delayed a bill that you agreed would go through the House yesterday, that you agreed the Parliamentary Joint Committee would respond to and report on yesterday morning, and you delayed it. You delayed it here, contrary to your agreement, and you did that because you thought it gave you some kind of a strategic advantage in bringing a bill back to this place which would unravel border protection. That's right. So here you are, delaying a bill meant to keep Australians safe from terrorists by allowing our law enforcement agencies to have appropriate powers to get into encrypted systems. You are delaying that national security bill in order to have a tactical win on a bill that would destroy another plank of Australia's national security and border protection. How bad can it get? How dishonest can you be? How much can you rely on using stunts which blow up in your face to try and embarrass a government? And the only people you've embarrassed are yourselves. You've shown exactly who you are, exactly what you're made of, and it doesn't do anything for any man, woman or child. Australia needs strong border protection. That is what we have given this country for 5 years. And right now, up there and behind the doors of your offices, you are trying to do deals, destroy legislation and undo the protection that we have offered for the Australian people at their borders, for the people who were the victims of people smugglers. What you are doing is an absolute disgrace, and it goes to the very core of the way that you conduct politics and the very core of your failure to understand what is necessary to protect Australia's borders. This has been stunt upon stunt upon stunt, and it's blowing up in your face, and you know it. And if you want to have an argument about border protection, bring it on. Bring it on every day between now and the election, because that is what the Australian people need to know, is what you will do if you ever got your hands back on that policy again, and it will result in the deaths of children at sea.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The member for Kennedy.
You're a rare phenomenon in this parliament where I stand up to defend the ALP and the LNP, but I am left no alternative but to go to this ugly scenario. We all greeted the legislation with cynicism. I got rings from the trade union movement in Queensland, and I hadn't looked at the legislation, and my chief of staff said divestment, and I said no, we want nationalisation. I'm rural socialist, and but if we can't get nationalisation, I suppose we've got to go along with. And then suddenly it occurred to me, as it did to the ALP, that sneaky trick to get all the Queensland electricity industry sold off. Now, this is where I depart from the ALP, because everyone in Queensland knows, including the trade union movement, there is nothing that the ALP in Queensland wants more than to sell the electricity industry. They tried to sell it and got themselves annihilated in an election, selling the railways and half selling the electricity industry. So they're scared, but they know they can buy their way through the next election if they sell the 15,000 million. But let me say, I would agree with almost everything the ALP has said today, because that was exactly what I was saying to the Treasurer. Now, I've got to defend the Treasurer here, because I said this is a cheap, sneaky trick to sell the Snowy and to sell the Queensland electricity industry. And he said, no, it's not. And I said, well, you prove it by passing a piece of legislation preventing it. And he said, yes, I will, which I was quite stunned. I didn't have a plan B, you know. So he said, well, you draft the legislation. So I draft the legislation. But either the Treasurer is an extremely good actor, for which we're congratulating, or alternatively, he was quite genuine and honest. But in this case, it's my opinion that he was playing a straight bat. If you're not going to nationalise it, and this side of the House doesn't want that, and that side of the House doesn't want that, this little group over here does want that, but we're a minority. So if you're not going to nationalise it, divestment, Theodore Roosevelt, everybody knows the story. Divestment was forced upon Eastern Standard Oil Company, New Jersey, and Rockefeller was broken up 20 or 30 parts. And everyone knew it was one of the great moments in world history. Now, you know, divestment, all right, well, if we can't have nationalisation, then we're going to go to divestment. So, but the other side of it was it a sneaky trick to force the sale of the assets? So we moved the amendment that prevents that. There is absolutely no purpose in selling a Stanwell to another government department. And that's what and it has to be in the same state as well, because you could sell it maybe to another state. So, Mr. Speaker, I stand up on a very rare occasion to defend both sides of the House. I think both of them have gone through with the best of intent.
The time allotted for this debate has expired. The question is that the motion moved by the member for McMahon be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the motion moved by the member for McMahon be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Morton tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Gray and Murray tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 72. The question is therefore negatived. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.